Marcus Thompson had seen plenty of storms roll across the Nebraska plains during his 42 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover in his barn on that rain-soaked October morning. What started as a routine check on his livestock would uncover a secret that would transform not just his life, but an entire community's understanding of what it truly means to protect the vulnerable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 8 years. Marcus Thompson's calloused hand reached out to silence the noise before it could wake the entire farmhouse, though in truth, there was no one else to disturb. The 2-story white clapboard house that had sheltered 3 generations of Thompsons now echoed with the footsteps of just one man, moving through rooms that still held the faint scent of his grandmother's lavender sachets and his grandfather's pipe tobacco. Marcus swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet finding the worn wooden floors that creaked in all the familiar places. At 6'2", with broad shoulders earned from years of farm work, he moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone whose days were governed by the needs of animals and the rhythms of weather. His dark hair, prematurely touched with silver at the temples, caught the moonlight streaming through the bedroom window as he pulled on his work clothes, faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and the steel-toed boots that had seen him through countless seasons. The Thompson Farm sat on 320 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, 20 miles outside the small town of Milfield, population 2,847. It was the kind of place where pickup trucks outnumbered sedans 3-1, where the local diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and where everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. The farm had been in Marcus's family since 1923, when his great-grandfather, Samuel Thompson, had scraped together enough money to buy the land and build the barn that still stood as the property's most prominent feature. That barn, painted red, with white trim and topped by a weather vane shaped like a rooster, had witnessed nearly a century of Nebraska history. It had sheltered cattle during blizzards that buried fence posts, stored hay through drought years when every blade of grass was precious, and served as a refuge for countless farm cats and their litters. The massive structure, built from local timber and held together by hand-forged nails, was large enough to house 30 head of cattle, with a hayloft that could store enough feed to last through the harshest winter. Marcus made his way downstairs, his hand trailing along the banister that had been polished smooth by generations of Thompson hands. The kitchen still bore the touches of his late wife, Sarah, who had passed away 3 years earlier after a brief but fierce battle with cancer. Her blue and white checkered curtains hung at the windows, and her collection of ceramic roosters still perched on the windowsill above the sink. Marcus had left everything exactly as she'd arranged it, finding comfort in the illusion that she might walk through the door at any moment, flour dusting her apron and a smile lighting up her face. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Marcus measured out grounds with the precision of ritual. Sarah had always teased him about his coffee-making ceremony, claiming he approached it with the same seriousness that most people reserved for religious observances. But the routine grounded him, provided structure to days that could otherwise feel boundless and empty. As the rich aroma filled the kitchen, Marcus stepped onto the back porch to check the weather. October in Nebraska could be unpredictable, swinging from warm autumn days to early winter storms with little warning. This morning, thick clouds obscured the stars, and the air carried the heavy moisture that promised rain before noon. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and made mental notes about which animals needed to be moved to covered areas and which equipment should be secured against the coming storm. The farm currently housed 43 head of Angus cattle, 12 horses, and an assortment of chickens that roamed the property with the confidence of creatures that had never known a predator they couldn't outrun. Marcus had inherited the operation from his grandfather, Thomas Thompson, who had passed away when Marcus was 26 and still learning the difference between farming and agriculture. The old man had been a stern teacher, but a generous spirit, instilling in Marcus not just the practical skills needed to work the land, but a deep respect for the responsibility that came with caring for living things. "Land doesn't belong to us," Thomas had said during one of their last conversations, his weathered hands gesturing toward the endless expanse of prairie grass. "We belong to the land. Our job is to take care of it so it can take care of the next generation." Those words had shaped Marcus's approach to farming, leading him to adopt sustainable practices that prioritized soil health and animal welfare over short-term profits. The community of Milfield had always known Marcus as a quiet, reliable man who kept to himself, but could be counted on in times of crisis. When the Peterson farm was threatened by flooding 2 springs ago, Marcus had been among the first to show up with sandbags and a willingness to work through the night. When elderly Mrs. Patterson needed help bringing in her hay before a storm, Marcus had arrived with his equipment and refused any payment beyond a glass of her famous iced tea. His reputation was built on actions rather than words, on the kind of quiet dependability that rural communities valued above all else. But Marcus's solitary nature had deepened since Sarah's death. Where once the couple had been active members of the Milfield Methodist Church, attending services every Sunday and volunteering for community events, Marcus now found himself declining invitations and avoiding social gatherings. The well-meaning sympathy of neighbors, their gentle suggestions that he get back out there, and their attempts to introduce him to eligible widows from neighboring towns, felt like salt in wounds that hadn't yet healed. Sarah had been his high school sweetheart, the girl with cornflower blue eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. They had married young, at 22, with dreams of filling the old farmhouse with children and continuing the Thompson legacy for another generation. But those dreams had been complicated by Sarah's struggle with fertility, years of treatments and disappointments that had tested their marriage but ultimately strengthened their bond. They had been in the process of adopting when Sarah received her cancer diagnosis, and the cruel irony of finally having hope for a family, just as their time together was running out, had left Marcus with a bitterness he struggled to overcome. Now at 42, Marcus found himself caught between a past he couldn't reclaim and a future he couldn't envision. The farm provided purpose and routine, but the isolation that had once felt peaceful now sometimes felt like a prison. He spoke mainly to his animals, his conversations with the cattle and horses serving as the primary human interaction in days that could pass without seeing another soul. The town of Milfield, 20 miles away, was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but large enough to provide the basic necessities of rural life. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, anchored by Miller's hardware store at one end and the First National Bank at the other. In between, residents could find everything they needed. Peterson's Grocery, where 3 generations of Petersons had served the community. The Milfield Diner, famous for its chicken fried steak and pie that people drove 50 miles to taste. And Thompson's Feed Store, run by Marcus's distant cousin Dale, who shared the family name but little of Marcus's reserved nature. The social fabric of Milfield was woven tight, with connections stretching back generations and relationships that had weathered decades of good times and bad. The Methodist Church served as the community's spiritual center, while the high school football team provided its rallying point during autumn Friday nights. The annual Corn Festival in September brought together neighboring towns for 3 days of celebration that featured everything from pie contests to tractor pulls. And the Christmas pageant at the church was a tradition that drew visitors from across the county. But beneath the surface harmony of small-town life, Milfield struggled with the same challenges facing rural communities across the Midwest. Young people left for college and rarely returned, drawn to cities that offered opportunities their hometown couldn't provide. Family farms were being sold to agricultural corporations, changing the landscape both literally and figuratively. The main street that had once bustled with activity now showed the empty storefronts and faded signs that marked the slow decline of rural America. Marcus was acutely aware of these changes, having watched childhood friends scatter to the winds and family farms disappear under the plow of industrial agriculture. His own operation was successful but modest, generating enough income to maintain the property and support his simple lifestyle, but not enough to expand or modernize in ways that might ensure its future viability. He sometimes wondered if he was the last Thompson who would work this land, if the legacy his great-grandfather had established would end with him. The financial pressures of modern farming were constant but manageable for Marcus, who had learned from his grandfather's example to live within his means and avoid the debt that had destroyed other operations. The farm was paid for, inherited, free and clear, and Marcus had built up enough savings to weather the inevitable bad years that came with depending on weather, commodity prices, and the countless variables that could make or break a harvest. His daily routine varied little from season to season. Morning chores began before dawn with feeding and checking on the cattle, followed by tending to the horses and ensuring that all the animals had adequate water and shelter. The middle of the day was devoted to whatever seasonal work demanded attention: planting in spring, haying in summer, harvest in fall, and equipment maintenance during the winter months. Evening chores mirrored the morning routine, with a final check on all the animals before darkness fell and the cycle began again. Marcus had always found satisfaction in this rhythm, in the honest work of caring for the land and the animals that depended on him. But lately, the solitude that had once felt peaceful had begun to feel oppressive. Conversations with his cattle about weather patterns and crop prices were poor substitutes for the kind of human connection that Sarah had brought to his life. He found himself driving to town more often than necessary, lingering at the feed store or the diner just to hear other voices, to feel part of something larger than his own quiet existence. The farmhouse itself reflected Marcus's practical nature and his reluctance to change anything that Sarah had touched. The living room still bore her decorative choices, the couch covered in a quilt her mother had made, the bookshelf filled with her romance novels and his agricultural journals, the photographs that chronicled their life together from their wedding day through their last anniversary. The kitchen remained exactly as she had left it, down to the shopping list still magneted to the refrigerator in her careful handwriting. Marcus's evenings were spent in the living room, reading farming publications or watching the weather forecast, with the intensity of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding the sky's moods. He had little interest in television beyond the agricultural reports and weather updates, finding most entertainment frivolous compared to the serious business of working the land. His reading material consisted primarily of farming journals, livestock publications, and the occasional novel that Sarah had recommended before her death. Sleep came easily to Marcus, exhaustion from physical labor ensuring that he rarely lay awake worrying about problems beyond his control. But his dreams were often filled with memories of Sarah, conversations they had shared, plans they had made, the future they had envisioned together. He would wake some mornings with the distinct impression that she had been beside him, only to find her side of the bed cold and empty, the silence of the house settling around him like a heavy blanket. This October morning felt different somehow, though Marcus couldn't identify exactly what had changed. The air was heavier than usual, charged with the electricity that often preceded significant weather events. The cattle seemed restless in their pasture, and even his most reliable horse, a gentle mare named Belle, had refused to approach when he called. Animals had instincts that humans had largely lost, Marcus knew, and their behavior often served as an early warning system for storms, predators, or other disturbances that might threaten the peace of rural life. As Marcus finished his coffee and prepared for morning chores, He had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in his quiet life. The storm approaching from the west carried more than rain and wind. It carried the kind of change that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about solitude, responsibility, and the true meaning of family. In a few hours, his carefully ordered world would be turned upside down by a discovery that would force him to confront questions about his purpose, his capacity for love, and his willingness to risk everything for people he had never met. The barn that had sheltered generations of Thompson livestock was about to become the setting for a drama that would test Marcus's character in ways he had never imagined, and ultimately reveal depths of compassion and courage that he didn't know he possessed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke loose at 7:23 a.m., just as Marcus was crossing the muddy yard between the farmhouse and the barn. The first fat raindrops splattered against his jacket with the force of small stones, and within minutes, the sky opened up with the kind of fury that Nebraska farmers both feared and respected. Lightning split the gray sky in jagged white lines, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. Marcus quickened his pace, his boots squelching through mud that was rapidly becoming treacherous. The cattle had already sought shelter under the metal-roofed lean-to attached to the barn's east side, their dark shapes huddled together against the elements. The horses had retreated to the covered area near the water trough, their ears flicking nervously with each crack of thunder. Even the chickens, usually scattered across the yard in their endless search for bugs and seeds, had found refuge wherever they could squeeze their feathered bodies. The barn door, heavy oak reinforced with iron strapping, required Marcus's full strength to slide open against the wind that seemed determined to keep it closed. The familiar smell of hay, leather, and livestock greeted him as he stepped inside. But something else lingered in the air, something that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world. It was the faint scent of wood smoke, as if someone had been burning small fires, and underneath it, the unmistakable smell of people who had been living rough. Marcus paused inside the entrance, water dripping from his jacket onto the worn wooden floor. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the barn, slowly adjusted to reveal the familiar sight of hay bales stacked to the rafters, the old tractor that had belonged to his grandfather, and the various tools and equipment that made up the infrastructure of farm life. But as he moved deeper into the cavernous space, his trained farmer's eye began to notice subtle disturbances that spoke of recent human presence. A section of hay bales in the far corner had been rearranged, creating what looked like a small shelter or hideout. The straw on the floor showed scuff marks and indentations that suggested people had been walking and sleeping in areas where only Marcus's boots should have left their mark. Near the ladder leading to the hayloft, he spotted something that made his heart skip: a child's sneaker, small enough to belong to someone no older than 8 or 9. Muddy and worn, as if it had traveled many hard miles. The discovery sent a chill down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through his clothes. Someone had been living in his barn, and from the evidence, it wasn't just one person. The thought of strangers taking shelter on his property without permission should have made him angry, but instead, Marcus felt a growing concern about what circumstances had driven people to seek refuge in a place so far from town, so isolated from help. As if summoned by his thoughts, a soft sound reached his ears from the direction of the hayloft, a sound like someone trying very hard not to cough. The kind of suppressed noise that children make when they're attempting to remain hidden. Marcus's head tilted upward toward the loft, his farmer's instincts telling him to investigate, while his human compassion warned him to proceed carefully. Whoever was up there was clearly frightened, and Marcus knew that sudden movements or loud voices could send scared people running into a storm that was quickly becoming dangerous. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice gentle but carrying clearly through the barn. "Is someone up there? I'm not going to hurt you. This is my farm, and I just want to make sure everyone's okay." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus began to wonder if he had imagined the sound. But then he heard it again, definitely a cough, followed by what sounded like someone shushing others in urgent whispers. The voices were high-pitched, unmistakably those of children, and Marcus felt his protective instincts surge to life in a way they hadn't since Sarah's death. "Look, I know you're up there," Marcus continued, moving slowly toward the ladder. "The storm's getting worse, and I need to check on my animals, but I also need to know that you're safe. Are any of you hurt? Do you need help?" A long moment passed before a voice answered from the loft, a woman's voice, trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Please don't call the police. We're not stealing anything. We'll leave as soon as the storm passes. Just please don't call anyone." The desperation in her tone struck Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't someone seeking adventure or trying to cause trouble. This was someone running from something, seeking shelter with the kind of desperation that came from having nowhere else to go. Marcus placed his foot on the bottom rung of the ladder, then paused. "I'm coming up," he said slowly. "I'm not calling anyone. I just want to see if you need medical attention or food. My name is Marcus Thompson, and this is my farm. You're safe here." The climb up the ladder seemed to take forever, each rung bringing Marcus closer to a discovery that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The hayloft stretched across the entire length of the barn, filled with bales of sweet-smelling alfalfa and Timothy hay that Marcus had put up during the summer. But in the far corner, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the small windows, he could make out shapes that didn't belong among the agricultural supplies. As his eyes adjusted, the shapes resolved into people, a woman, and what appeared to be 5 children, huddled together behind a makeshift wall of hay bales. They had created a small living space with blankets that looked like they had been salvaged from various sources, a few plastic containers that probably held their meager possessions, and the remains of what looked like a small cooking fire built in a metal bucket. The woman was young, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair that hung in tangles around a face marked by exhaustion, and what Marcus recognized with a surge of anger as fresh bruises. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, and finger-shaped marks on her throat suggested she had been grabbed or choked recently. She positioned herself protectively in front of the children, her body language making it clear that she would fight with whatever strength she had left to keep them safe. The children ranged in age, from what looked like about 4 years old to perhaps 12, and Marcus's heart broke to see the fear in their eyes, the way they pressed against each other for comfort and security. They were dirty and thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days and shoes that were falling apart. But what struck Marcus most was the alertness in their expressions. These were children who had learned to be constantly vigilant, to watch for danger and be ready to run at a moment's notice. "Ma'am," Marcus said softly, staying near the ladder and making no move to approach them. "My name is Marcus Thompson. This is my farm, my barn. You don't need to be afraid of me. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes darted between Marcus and the ladder behind him, clearly calculating whether she could get herself and the children past him if they needed to escape. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse and strained. "I'm Rebecca Collins," she said. "These are my children. Well, 4 of them are mine, and 1 is my neighbor's daughter. We've been traveling for 3 days. We just needed somewhere dry to sleep. We haven't taken anything, I promise." Marcus noticed how she held her left arm close to her body, and the careful way she moved suggested ribs that might be bruised or broken. The children pressed closer to her, and Marcus could see that they were all suffering from the effects of exposure and poor nutrition. The youngest, a little girl with blonde pigtails, was shivering despite the blankets wrapped around her small frame. "Rebecca," Marcus said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. When was the last time you and the children had a hot meal or a warm bath? You look like you've been through hell, and those kids need medical attention. We can't go to a hospital, Rebecca said quickly, panic flashing in her eyes. And we can't stay here. If he finds us. She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus didn't need her to. The bruises on her face, the terror in her voice, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, it all painted a picture that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. Someone had hurt this woman and threatened these children badly enough to send them fleeing into the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Who's looking for you, Rebecca? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. My husband, she whispered, and the words seemed to take all her remaining strength. He said, he'd kill me if I ever tried to leave with the kids. Last night, he came home drunk and angry, and he had a gun. I thought he was going to. She glanced at the children and stopped herself from finishing the thought. Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same protective fury he had felt years ago when he'd witnessed a neighbor mistreating his livestock. But this was worse. These were children, innocent kids who should have been safe in their beds instead of huddling in a barn, afraid for their lives. The oldest child, a boy who looked to be about 12, spoke up for the first time. Are you going to make us leave? He asked, his voice trying to sound brave but cracking with fear. Because we don't have anywhere else to go. Mom said we could hide here until we figured out what to do next. Marcus looked at the boy, Rebecca's son, clearly, and saw something of himself at that age, the serious expression of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. The protective stance he took in front of his younger siblings reminded Marcus of his own childhood when he'd felt responsible for everything and everyone on the farm. What's your name, son? Marcus asked. Danny, the boy replied. Danny Collins. These are my sisters Emma and Lucy, and my brother Jake. And this is Mia, her mom was our neighbor. But she died last month, and there was nobody else to take care of her. The simple statement hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. 5 children, 4 of them siblings, and 1 an orphan neighbor child, all depending on a young mother who was clearly at the end of her rope. Rebecca Collins had not only fled an abusive husband with her own children, but had taken responsibility for a 5th child who had no one else in the world. How old are you, Danny? Marcus asked. 12. I'm the oldest, so I help take care of everyone else. The boy's chin lifted with pride, and Marcus recognized the fierce protectiveness that came from being thrust into a caretaker role before you were ready for it. Marcus looked around the makeshift camp the family had created in his hayloft. They had been resourceful, using hay bales to create windbreaks and conserve warmth, arranging their few possessions with the efficiency born of necessity. But it was clear they couldn't survive much longer under these conditions. The children needed food, warmth, medical attention, and above all, safety. Rebecca, Marcus said, his mind already working through the implications of what he was about to offer. You and the children can't stay up here. It's too cold, and that little one looks like she's getting sick. I have a big farmhouse that's mostly empty. You could stay there, at least until we figure out a better solution. We can't, Rebecca said immediately. If someone sees us, if word gets back to him, you don't understand what he's capable of. He has friends in the police department, people who would tell him where we are. We can't put you in danger. Marcus studied her face, seeing the conflict between desperate need and genuine concern for his safety. This was a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point, but still retained enough compassion to worry about a stranger's welfare. How long since you've slept in a real bed, Rebecca? How long since these kids had a hot meal? Marcus pressed gently. Look at them. They're exhausted, hungry, and scared. Whatever happened to bring you here, whatever you're running from, those children need help right now. As if to emphasize his point, the youngest girl, Lucy Danny had called her, began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of chest congestion and the beginnings of pneumonia. Rebecca immediately pulled the child closer, but Marcus could see the panic in her eyes as she realized how sick her daughter was becoming. "That cough needs medical attention," Marcus said firmly. "And all of you need food and rest. I live alone on this farm. My nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. Nobody's going to see you if you don't want to be seen." The storm outside seemed to emphasize his words, thunder rolling across the prairie and rain drumming against the barn roof with increasing intensity. The wind howled around the building, finding every gap and crack to whistle through, and Marcus knew that spending another night in the unheated barn could have serious consequences for all of them, especially the youngest children. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me," Marcus continued, "but I give you my word, I won't call anyone without your permission. I won't do anything that puts you or the children at risk. But they need help, Rebecca, and I can provide it." Rebecca looked down at little Lucy, whose cough was becoming more frequent and more concerning. The other children watched their mother with the kind of intense attention that children develop when their survival depends on adult decisions they can't influence. Marcus could see the moment when Rebecca's maternal instincts overcame her fear, when the need to protect her children trumped her terror of being found. "Just for tonight?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Just until the weather clears and Lucy feels better?" Marcus nodded, though he suspected that one night would quickly become longer once he got a better look at their situation. "Just for tonight," he agreed. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." As he helped Rebecca and the children gather their few possessions and prepare to make the journey from the barn to the farmhouse, Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. It was the feeling of being needed, of having a purpose beyond the daily routine of feeding animals and maintaining equipment. These people had stumbled into his life at the exact moment when he had begun to wonder if his solitary existence had any meaning beyond mere survival. The farmhouse that had felt too large and too empty for the past 3 years was about to be filled with voices, with the chaos and complications that came with caring for people rather than livestock. Marcus didn't yet realize that he was about to discover what he had been missing in his carefully controlled, predictable life, the messy, challenging, ultimately rewarding work of building a family from the broken pieces that life sometimes delivered to your doorstep. The journey from the barn to the farmhouse should have taken less than 2 minutes under normal circumstances, but nothing about this October morning could be considered normal. The storm had intensified while Marcus spoke with Rebecca and the children, transforming the familiar path between buildings into a treacherous obstacle course of mud, standing water, and debris blown by winds that seemed determined to knock everyone off their feet. Marcus carried little Lucy, the youngest child, wrapped in his own jacket to protect her from the driving rain. The 4-year-old felt alarmingly light in his arms, her small body burning with fever that he could feel even through the layers of clothing. Her breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a rattling wheeze that made Marcus's chest tight with worry. He had helped deliver enough calves and foals to recognize the signs of serious respiratory distress, and Lucy needed medical attention soon. Rebecca struggled alongside him, one arm supporting 10-year-old Emma while the other pressed against her own injured ribs. The pain medication she obviously needed was a luxury they couldn't afford, and Marcus could see her jaw clench with each step as she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, 12-year-old Danny shepherded his younger siblings, Jake and Mia, his thin shoulders squared with the responsibility he had clearly been carrying for far too long. The children moved with the cautious efficiency of people who had learned to travel light and move quickly, but Marcus could see exhaustion in every line of their small bodies. 8-year-old Jake stumbled repeatedly in the mud, his worn sneakers providing no traction on the slippery ground. 6-year-old Mia, the orphaned neighbor child, clutched a battered stuffed rabbit that was clearly her most precious possession. her eyes wide with the kind of hypervigilance that spoke of trauma no child should have to endure. When they finally reached the farmhouse's covered back porch, everyone was soaked through and shivering. Marcus fumbled with his keys, Lucy's weight, making his movements clumsy while the wind tried to tear the screen door from his grasp. The lock finally yielded, and they stumbled into the mudroom that Sarah had designed for exactly this kind of weather emergency, a space where wet coats and muddy boots could be shed before tracking chaos through the rest of the house. "There are towels in that cabinet," Marcus said, nodding toward a tall pine cupboard that Sarah had painted white to match the beadboard walls. "And some of my wife's, some clothes that might fit you, Rebecca, upstairs in the master bedroom. The children." He paused, realizing that his house, designed for a childless couple, contained nothing appropriate for kids ranging from 4 to 12 years old. "We'll make do," Rebecca said quietly, already pulling towels from the cabinet and beginning the process of drying off the children. Her movements were efficient despite her obvious pain, and Marcus could see that she had been managing crisis situations for a long time. "We're grateful for anything you can spare." Marcus gently lowered Lucy onto a wooden bench that ran along one wall of the mudroom, keeping his jacket wrapped around her small frame. The child's fever seemed to be climbing, and her breathing had become more labored during their short journey from the barn. Her blonde hair was plastered to her head with rain and sweat, and her usually bright blue eyes were glassy with illness. "Lucy needs to see a doctor," Marcus said, crouching down to look into the child's face. "That cough is getting worse, and she's burning up with fever." "No doctors," Rebecca said immediately, panic flashing across her bruised features. "They ask too many questions, require too much paperwork. If there's any record of us being here—" "Rebecca, look at her," Marcus said gently but firmly. "She's got pneumonia or something close to it. Without treatment, this could get life-threatening very quickly." Danny, who had been quietly helping his younger siblings out of their wet clothes, spoke up with the serious tone of a child forced to be an adult too early. "Mom, Lucy's been sick for 2 days. She's not getting better on her own." The conflict played out across Rebecca's face, the desperate need to protect her children warring with the equally desperate need to keep them hidden from the man who had driven them to flee in the night. Marcus watched her internal struggle and made a decision that would set the tone for everything that followed. "There's a veterinarian in Milfield named Dr. Jennifer Walsh," he said. "She's treated my animals for years, and before she specialized in veterinary medicine, she was a nurse practitioner. She's discreet. She might be willing to take a look at Lucy without getting authorities involved." Rebecca's head snapped up, hope and suspicion battling in her expression. "A veterinarian? You want an animal doctor to treat my daughter?" "Jennifer knows more about medicine than half the doctors in the county," Marcus said. "And she's not required to report things the way hospital personnel are. She's also a friend who can be trusted to keep her mouth shut." While Rebecca considered this option, Marcus began leading the group deeper into the farmhouse, automatically turning on lights and adjusting the thermostat to bring warmth to rooms that had been kept at energy-saving temperatures during his solitary occupancy. The house immediately felt different, with voices echoing through the halls, with small feet tracking water across floors that had known only his own footsteps for 3 years. The kitchen, still bearing Sarah's decorative touches, seemed to expand, with the presence of children who looked around with the wonder of people who hadn't seen domestic normalcy in far too long. Emma's eyes fixed on the ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill, while Jake stared with fascination at the electric coffee maker, as if hot beverages prepared at the push of a button were magical innovations he had never encountered. "Ah, you hungry?" Marcus asked, though the answer was obvious from the way the children's attention immediately focused on him at the mention of food. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning," Danny answered when his mother seemed too overwhelmed to respond. "We had some crackers and peanut butter that Mom packed when we left." Marcus felt anger surge through him, again not at Rebecca, who had clearly done the best she could under impossible circumstances, but at the man who had terrorized a family badly enough to send them fleeing with nothing but a few crackers too. Sustain them. He opened the refrigerator, mentally cataloging its contents and planning a meal that would be nourishing, but gentle enough for stomachs that had been empty too long. Rebecca, why don't you take the children into the living room while I fix something to eat? Marcus suggested. There's a fireplace in there, and it'll be warmer than the kitchen while I cook. We can help, Rebecca said automatically, clearly uncomfortable with accepting charity without offering something in return. You're injured and exhausted, Marcus replied firmly. The most helpful thing you can do right now is rest and let me take care of everyone for a little while. As the family moved toward the living room, Marcus caught sight of them in the hallway mirror that Sarah had hung near the front door. The group looked like refugees from a war zone, which, he reflected, wasn't far from the truth. The children stayed close to their mother, their eyes constantly scanning for threats, while Rebecca herself moved with the painful carefulness of someone nursing multiple injuries. Marcus turned his attention to the kitchen, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator and pantry with the efficiency born of years of cooking for himself. But this was different. This was cooking for people who needed more than sustenance. They needed comfort, warmth, the security that came from having someone care enough to prepare a proper meal. He decided on scrambled eggs with cheese, toast, and bacon, simple foods that would be easy on stomachs that hadn't seen regular meals, but substantial enough to begin addressing the obvious malnutrition he had observed in all 5 children. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah, about how she would have handled the situation. She had always been better with people than he was, more intuitive about emotional needs and social dynamics. The sound of voices from the living room provided a soundtrack to his cooking, and Marcus was struck by how the house felt alive in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death. There was something healing about hearing children's laughter, even the subdued, cautious laughter of kids who had learned to keep their joy quiet. Danny's voice rose above the others as he apparently tried to coax a smile from little Mia, and Marcus could hear Rebecca shushing Lucy's cough while trying to make her more comfortable. When the food was ready, Marcus carried plates and glasses into the living room on one of Sarah's serving trays, finding the family arranged around the fireplace that he had quickly lit to chase away the chill from their rain-soaked clothes. The children's eyes widened at the sight of the food, and Marcus realized they were waiting for permission to eat, another sign that their lives had been controlled by fear and strict rules. Everyone dig in, Marcus said, setting the tray on the coffee table. There's plenty more in the kitchen if anyone's still hungry after this. What followed was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. The children ate with the desperate efficiency of people who had learned never to waste food or take their next meal for granted. Emma and Jake wolfed down their portions so quickly that Marcus worried they would make themselves sick, while Mia ate slowly and methodically, as if she was trying to make each bite last as long as possible. Danny, despite his own obvious hunger, spent most of his time helping Lucy eat small bites of scrambled egg and sips of milk, his protective instincts clearly stronger than his own needs. Rebecca picked at her food, her attention focused entirely on her children's well-being rather than her own nutritional needs. Rebecca, Marcus said gently, you need to eat too. You can't take care of them if you don't take care of yourself. No, she whispered, but her hands shook as she picked up her fork, and Marcus realized she was operating on adrenaline and willpower alone. The crash was coming, and when it hit, she would need every ounce of strength she could muster. As the immediate hunger pangs were addressed, the children began to relax slightly, though they remained alert and watchful. Emma curled up next to her mother on the couch, while Jake and Mia found spots on the rug in front of the fireplace, the warmth and full stomachs beginning to work their magic on small bodies that had been pushed beyond their limits. The rains Supposed to keep up most of the day, Marcus said, glancing toward the windows where the storm continued to rage. You're welcome to rest here, get warm and dry. We can figure out next steps once everyone's feeling better. What if he comes looking? Rebecca asked, the question that was clearly never far from her mind. This farm is 20 miles from town, at the end of a private road, Marcus replied. Nobody comes here unless they have specific business with me. And with this storm, even. My neighbors are going to stay put until it passes. But even as he offered reassurance, Marcus found himself thinking about practical concerns. How long could he hide 6 people on his property? What would happen when Rebecca's husband realized they weren't coming back? How many people in Milfield already knew that Rebecca Collins and her children were missing? The questions multiplied in his mind, but looking at Lucy's flushed face and labored breathing, at the exhaustion etched in every line of Rebecca's bruised features, at the way the other children had finally stopped scanning the room for escape routes, Marcus knew that immediate concerns had to take precedence over long-term planning. Danny, Marcus said, addressing the 12-year-old who was clearly the family's second in command, do you think your mom would be okay with me calling Dr. Walsh about Lucy? Just to see if she can come take a look without making it official? Danny looked at his mother, who seemed to be struggling with the decision. Finally, Rebecca nodded slowly. If you trust her, she said. If you really think she won't report. This ... double quote. I trust her with my life, Marcus said simply. And more importantly, I trust her with Lucy's life. As Marcus went to make the phone call that would bring the first outsider into their secret, he reflected on how quickly his orderly, predictable world had been turned upside down. This morning, his biggest concern had been whether to move the cattle to shelter before the storm hit. Now he was harboring what amounted to refugees, preparing to ask a friend to bend professional rules, and contemplating how to protect 5 children and their mother from a man who apparently had no qualms about using violence to maintain control. The transformation felt both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. For the first time since Sarah's death, Marcus felt truly needed, truly useful for something more important than maintaining agricultural operations. These people had stumbled into his life at a moment when he had been questioning his purpose, and now he found himself with the most important purpose of all, protecting the innocent and providing safety for those who had nowhere else to turn. Doctor Jennifer Walsh answered on the second ring, her voice professional but warm. Marcus, what's wrong? Are you calling about one of your animals in this weather? Jennifer, Marcus said, lowering his voice so the conversation couldn't be overheard. From the living room, I need your help with something unusual. And I need your word that this conversation stays between us. There was a pause, and when Dr. Walsh spoke again, her tone had sharpened with concern. Marcus, what's going on? I have a sick child here who needs medical attention, but there are circumstances that make a hospital visit ... complicated. Can you come out to the farm? Another pause, longer this time. Then, how sick and how complicated? Pneumonia, I think. 4 years old, high fever, labored breathing. And the complicated part involves domestic violence and people who need to stay hidden. I'll be there. In an hour, Dr. Walsh said without hesitation. And Marcus? You did the right thing calling me. As Marcus hung up the phone and returned to the living room, he found that the combination of warmth, food, and safety had worked its predictable magic. Jake and Mia were dozing on the rug, while Emma had fallen asleep curled against her mother's side. Only Danny remained fully alert, his young face bearing the weight of responsibility that should have belonged to adults. Lucy's condition, however, seemed to be worsening. Her breathing was more labored, and the flush of fever in her cheeks had deepened to an alarming red. Rebecca held her youngest daughter with the desperate tenderness of a mother who felt helpless to ease her child's suffering. Dr. Walsh is coming, Marcus said quietly. She's a good person, Rebecca. She helped Lucy, and she won't ask questions you don't want to answer. Rebecca nodded, tears sliding down her bruised cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know why you're helping us, but thank you." Marcus settled into his grandfather's old recliner, watching over this unexpected family that had sought shelter in his barn and was now filling his house with the complicated mix of joy and worry that came with caring for children. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, for the first time in years, the old farmhouse felt like a home again. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived exactly 58 minutes after Marcus's phone call, her mud-splattered pickup truck pulling into the farmhouse driveway with the confidence of someone who had navigated rural roads in every conceivable weather condition. Through the living room window, Marcus watched her gather what appeared to be 2 medical bags from the passenger seat, pulling her rain hood up against the storm that showed no signs of abating. Jennifer Walsh was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with steel-gray hair typically pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with the steady precision of someone who had spent 2 decades treating everything from injured livestock to emergency field surgeries. Her transition from human medicine to veterinary practice had been motivated by a desire for the kind of straightforward medical challenges that didn't involve insurance companies, bureaucratic red tape, or the complex social dynamics that often complicated treating people. But Marcus knew that her medical training and natural compassion made her uniquely qualified to help in situations exactly like this one. The knock on the front door was soft but authoritative, the kind of knock that announced medical help had arrived. Marcus opened the door to find Jennifer standing on his porch, water dripping from her yellow rain slicker and concern etched in the lines around her brown eyes. "Where's the patient?" she asked without preamble, stepping into the foyer and immediately beginning to shed her wet outer gear with the efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency calls. "Living room," Marcus replied, leading her toward the sound of Lucy's increasingly labored breathing. "Her name is Lucy Collins. She's 4 years old, and she's been sick for at least 2 days, maybe longer." Jennifer paused in the doorway of the living room, taking in the scene with the trained eye of someone who had learned to assess both medical and social situations quickly. Her gaze moved from Lucy's flushed, fevered face to Rebecca's bruised features, from the children's worn, ill-fitting clothes to the way they all positioned themselves defensively around their mother. "I'm Dr. Walsh," Jennifer said, addressing Rebecca directly while setting her medical bags on the coffee table. "Marcus called me because he was worried about your daughter. I need to examine her, but first I want you to know that I'm here as a friend, not as someone who's going to create problems for your family." Rebecca's grip on Lucy tightened reflexively, and Marcus could see the conflict playing out across her face. Trust had clearly become a rare commodity in her world, and inviting even a friendly stranger into their circle of safety required a leap of faith that felt dangerous. "She won't report anything," Marcus said quietly, understanding Rebecca's hesitation. "Jennifer's helped me through some difficult situations over the years, and she's never broken a confidence." Danny, who had been watching the interaction with the intensity of a child forced to evaluate every adult for potential threats, spoke up unexpectedly. "Lucy can't breathe right," he said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting critical information. "And her fever keeps getting worse no matter what Mom does." Jennifer nodded seriously at Danny, treating him with the respect due to someone who had clearly been serving as a secondary caretaker. "Thank you for that information, Danny. You've been taking good care of your family. Can you help me by keeping everyone calm while I examine Lucy?" The examination that followed was thorough but gentle, with Jennifer explaining each step to both Rebecca and Lucy in soothing tones that demonstrated her experience with frightened patients. She listened to Lucy's breathing with a stethoscope, checked her temperature, examined her throat, and palpated her neck and chest with hands that moved with practiced competence. "Pneumonia," Jennifer confirmed after several minutes, her expression serious but not panicked. "Lower respiratory tract Infection, probably bacterial. She needs antibiotics, and she needs them soon. But this is treatable, Rebecca. With proper medication, she should start feeling better within 24 hours. Antibiotics require a prescription, Rebecca said, defeat creeping into her voice. And prescriptions require doctors and insurance and records that can be traced. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, clearly working through the implications of the situation. As a veterinarian, she had access to antibiotics that were chemically identical to those used in human medicine, but using them to treat a child would technically violate numerous regulations and professional standards. However, looking at Lucy's labored breathing and that of Rebecca's desperate face, Jennifer made a decision that prioritized human need over regulatory compliance. "I have amoxicillin in my veterinary supplies," she said carefully. "The medication is identical to what a pediatrician would prescribe. I can calculate the correct dosage for Lucy's weight and age." "You could lose your license," Marcus said, understanding the risk Jennifer was taking. "Some things are more important than licenses," Jennifer replied, already reaching for her second medical bag. "Besides, who's going to know? The patient is getting the treatment she needs, and that's what matters." While Jennifer prepared Lucy's medication, calculating dosages and explaining administration schedules to Rebecca, Marcus found himself studying the other children more closely. Now that the immediate crisis of Lucy's illness was being addressed, he could see other signs of neglect and trauma that spoke to the conditions they had been living under before their escape. 8-year-old Jake bore what looked like partially healed bruises on his upper arms, the kind of marks that came from being grabbed too roughly by adult hands. 6-year-old Mia flinched whenever anyone moved quickly near her, and she hadn't spoken a single word since arriving at the farmhouse. 10-year-old Emma stayed close to her mother at all times, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if expecting danger to materialize at any moment. "Rebecca," Jennifer said as she finished preparing Lucy's first dose of antibiotic, "I need to ask some questions about everyone's health. Not for any official records, just so I know if anyone else needs immediate attention." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of what the family had endured. Rebecca's injuries included 2 cracked ribs, extensive bruising, and what Jennifer suspected was a mild concussion from the night they had fled. Jake's arm bruises were indeed from being grabbed, though Rebecca was reluctant to provide details about the circumstances. Emma had been suffering from recurring nightmares and anxiety attacks, while Mia hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone since her mother's death 6 weeks earlier. "What about you, Danny?" Jennifer asked, turning her attention to the 12-year-old who had been serving as the family's protector. "Any injuries I should know about?" Danny hesitated, glancing at his mother before rolling up his left sleeve to reveal a burn mark on his forearm, clearly the impression of a cigarette, deliberately inflicted. The sight made Marcus's hands clench into fists, while Jennifer's expression hardened with the kind of controlled anger that medical professionals learn to manage when confronting evidence of child abuse. "When did this happen?" Jennifer asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Last week," Danny replied. "I tried to stop him from hitting Mom, and he said I needed to learn my place." The simple statement hung in the air like a physical presence, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a protective fury unlike anything he had experienced since Sarah's death. This wasn't just about providing temporary shelter anymore. This was about protecting children who had been systematically terrorized by someone who should have been keeping them safe. "Rebecca," Jennifer said gently, "I need you to understand something. These children have been through severe trauma. The physical injuries will heal, but the emotional damage requires professional help. They need counseling, stability, and most importantly, they need to know that they're safe from further harm." "I know," Rebecca whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks, "but I don't know how to give them those things. I don't have money for counselors or lawyers or safe places to live. I worked part-time at a grocery store, and he controlled all the money. I don't even have identification he kept. Our important papers locked in a safe I couldn't access. Marcus listened to this litany of control and abuse, recognizing the systematic isolation that domestic abusers used to maintain power over their victims. Rebecca hadn't just been physically beaten. She had been deliberately stripped of resources, independence, and connections to the outside world that might have provided escape routes. "What's your husband's name?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Ray Collins," Rebecca said, and the name seemed to cause her physical pain. "He's a mechanic in Hartwell, about 60 miles from here. He has connections with people in law enforcement there. Friends who would help him track us down if they knew where to look." Marcus filed this information away, already beginning to think about the practical challenges of keeping a family hidden from someone with resources and determination to find them. 60 miles was far enough to provide some initial protection, but close enough that a systematic search could eventually reach them. "For now," Jennifer said, closing her medical bags after giving Lucy her first dose of antibiotic, "the most important thing is keeping everyone safe and healthy. Lucy should start responding to the medication within 12 to 18 hours. The fever should break, and her breathing should improve significantly." She turned to address the group as a whole, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone delivering important medical instructions. "Rebecca, you need rest and pain medication for those ribs. Danny, that burn needs to be cleaned and dressed daily until it heals completely. Emma and Jake, I want you to know that the bruises and soreness you're feeling will fade. But if anyone starts having severe nightmares or anxiety attacks, Marcus has my number." As Jennifer prepared to leave, she pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation near the front door, her expression serious and concerned. "Marcus, I don't know what you've gotten yourself into here, but you need to understand the risks," she said quietly. "If this Ray Collins is as dangerous as Rebecca suggests, and if he has law enforcement connections, you could be putting yourself in serious legal and physical danger by harboring his family. What's the alternative?" Marcus asked. "Send them back out into the storm? Turn them over to authorities who might send them back to him?" "No, of course not," Jennifer replied. "But you need to be prepared for the possibility that this situation could escalate quickly. Men who abuse their families don't typically give up easily when their victims escape." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the truth of her warning while feeling his resolve strengthen rather than weaken. "Jennifer, those children have been tortured by someone who was supposed to protect them. That little girl in there has a burn mark on his arm from his own father's cigarette. I can't send them back to that." "I'm not suggesting you should," Jennifer said. "I'm suggesting you think carefully about next steps. Rebecca is going to need legal help, a good attorney who specializes in domestic violence cases. The children are going to need documentation of their injuries for any future legal proceedings. And you're going to need a plan for what happens if Ray Collins shows up here looking for them." As Jennifer's truck disappeared into the storm, Marcus returned to the living room to find that the combination of warm food, medical attention, and relative safety had finally allowed exhaustion to overcome vigilance. Jake and Mia were asleep on the rug, while Emma dozed against her mother's shoulder. Lucy's breathing was still labored, but the antibiotic was already beginning to work its magic, and her fever seemed slightly less intense. Only Danny remained fully awake, his young face bearing the weight of concerns that no 12-year-old should have to carry. He looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed much older than his years. "Are we really safe here?" Danny asked quietly. Marcus settled into his chair, considering how to answer a question that touched on realities he was still processing himself. "For now, yes," he said. "But Danny, I want you to know that keeping your family safe might require some difficult decisions in the coming days. Are you prepared for that?" Danny nodded with the solemn gravity of someone who had been making difficult decisions for most of his young life, "Whatever it takes," he said. "These kids are all I have left, and Mom ... She needs someone to help her figure out what to do next." Looking at this boy who had assumed adult responsibilities before he was old enough to understand their full weight, Marcus felt his commitment to this unexpected family deepen into something approaching fierce devotion. The quiet, predictable life he had built since Sarah's death was officially over, replaced by something far more complicated and infinitely more meaningful. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the farmhouse, 6 people who had been strangers that morning were beginning the delicate process of becoming something that might eventually resemble a family. The transformation would require courage, sacrifice, and probably more strength than any of them knew they possessed. But for the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt truly alive with purpose. The first full day at the Thompson Farm dawned clear and crisp, with October sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't seen this much activity in 3 years. Marcus woke at his usual 4:30 a.m., but instead of the familiar silence that typically greeted him, he could hear the soft sounds of people sleeping throughout his house, quiet breathing, the rustle of blankets, and the occasional murmur from one of the children adjusting to sleeping in a real bed for the first time in days. Lucy's fever had broken during the night, just as Dr. Walsh had predicted. When Marcus checked on her before starting his morning chores, he found the 4-year-old sleeping peacefully in the guest room bed, her breathing finally clear and unlabored. Rebecca sat in the chair beside the bed, having maintained her vigil throughout the night despite her own exhaustion and injuries. She looked up when Marcus entered, relief and gratitude shining in her eyes. "The antibiotic worked," she whispered, careful not to wake her daughter. "Her fever broke about 3 hours ago, and she's been sleeping peacefully ever since." Marcus nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Dr. Walsh knows her business. Lucy should be feeling much better when she wakes up." "I don't know how to thank you," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my daughter's life. You would have done the same thing if you'd found a sick child." Marcus replied, uncomfortable with praise for what felt like basic human decency. "Why don't you try to get some real sleep? I'll listen for the children while I do morning chores." But Rebecca shook her head, her protective instincts still too strong to allow for complete relaxation. "I can't sleep when I don't know where they are. It's been too long since I could let my guard down completely." Marcus understood the hypervigilance that came from living in constant fear, though his own experience with it had been limited to the months following Sarah's cancer diagnosis, when every phone call and doctor's appointment had carried the potential for devastating news. For Rebecca, that state of alert tension had clearly become her normal way of existing in the world. "How about this?" Marcus suggested. "Come with me while I feed the animals. The kids are safe in the house, and you can see the whole property from the barn. Maybe being outside will help you feel less trapped." After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca agreed, and they made their way downstairs together. In the kitchen, Marcus quickly prepared a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, while Rebecca stood at the window watching the sun rise over fields that stretched to the horizon. The peaceful rural scene seemed to work some kind of magic on her tense shoulders, and Marcus could see her beginning to relax in small increments. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, "so quiet and peaceful. I'd forgotten places like this existed." Sarah used to say that the farm was like living inside a Norman Rockwell painting, Marcus said, handing her a steaming mug. "All the beauty of rural America without much of the harsh reality that most farmers deal with." "Sarah was your wife?" Rebecca asked, and Marcus realized this was the first personal question she had felt comfortable enough to ask. "For 15 years, Marcus replied. "She died 3 years ago, cancer. This place has been pretty quiet since then." They walked to the barn together, Marcus explaining the daily routine of caring for livestock, while Rebecca absorbed the normalcy of agricultural life. The cattle gathered at the fence line, expecting their morning hay, while the horses nickered. Greetings from their pasture. Even the chickens seemed to sense that something had changed in their domain, pecking curiously around Rebecca's feet as if investigating this new addition to their world. I grew up on a farm, Rebecca said unexpectedly, as they watched the cattle eat. Not as nice as this one, but similar. My father raised corn and soybeans in Iowa. I used to help with chores every morning before school. What happened to the farm? Marcus asked, sensing there was more to the story. Dad died when I was 17, and Mom couldn't manage it alone. She sold to a corporate agriculture company and moved to town. I met Ray right after graduation, and he convinced me to move away with him. Said farm life was for people who lacked ambition. Rebecca's voice carried the bitterness of someone who had given up something precious and spent years regretting the decision. Farming takes more ambition than most people realize, Marcus said. It's one of the few professions where you're completely responsible for the welfare of living things that depend on you for everything. As they worked together feeding animals and checking water systems, Marcus began to see glimpses of the person Rebecca had been before years of abuse had worn away. Her confidence and independence. She moved around the livestock with the easy familiarity of someone who understood animal behavior, and her questions about his farming operation showed an intelligence that had been suppressed but not destroyed. Danny's been worried about missing school, Rebecca said as they headed back toward the house. He's always been a good student, and he's concerned about falling behind. Marcus filed this information away, adding education to the growing list of challenges this family would face. Enrolling the children in Milfield's school system would require documentation, official addresses, and the kind of paper trail that could lead Ray Collins directly to them. When they returned to the farmhouse, they found the other children awake and exploring their temporary sanctuary with the cautious curiosity of young people who had learned to be grateful for small comforts. Emma was in the kitchen, staring with fascination at the automatic coffee maker, while Jake and Mia sat at the dining room table examining Sarah's collection of ceramic salt and pepper shakers, as if they were precious artifacts. Danny had positioned himself near the front window, maintaining the watch that had clearly become his responsibility during their time on the run. At 12 years old, he carried himself with the alertness of a soldier on guard duty, and Marcus realized that this boy had been functioning as the family's early warning system for far too long. "How's everyone feeling this morning?" Marcus asked, addressing the group while mentally cataloging their physical and emotional states. "Lucy's fever is gone," Emma announced with the relief of a sister who had been deeply worried. "She woke up asking for breakfast, which means she's feeling better." "I'm hungry too," Jake admitted. Looking slightly embarrassed by this basic human need, Marcus began preparing what would become the first of many large family breakfasts in his previously quiet kitchen. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, and fresh fruit filled plates and filled the house with the aromas of domestic normalcy that none of these children had experienced in far too long. As they ate, Marcus observed the family dynamics that were beginning to emerge in the safety of his home. Danny continued to function as a protective older brother, making sure his siblings had enough food before eating his own portion. Emma showed signs of being the family peacemaker, quick to comfort younger children and mediate disputes before they could escalate. Jake was clearly the family clown, making silly faces and telling jokes that coaxed smiles from even the traumatized Mia. Herself remained largely silent, but Marcus noticed that she had begun to relax slightly, her death grip on the stuffed rabbit loosening enough to allow her to eat with both hands. Her eyes, while still wary, no longer darted constantly toward exits and escape routes. "Mrs. Thompson had a lot of books," Danny observed, gesturing toward the living room shelves that Sarah had filled with her extensive collection of novels, biographies, and reference materials. "She was a teacher before we got married," Marcus explained. "Elementary school. She believed that houses should be full of books, because you never knew when someone might need to learn something new. Could we maybe read some of them? Emma asked tentatively, as if requesting permission to engage with literature was a privilege that might be denied. You can read any book in this house, Marcus said firmly. Sarah would have loved knowing that children were enjoying her collection. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Within hours of feeling safe and fed, the children began to exhibit behaviors that Marcus recognized as normal childhood curiosity and energy. Emma disappeared into the living room with a novel that looked far too advanced for a 10-year-old, but which she handled with obvious reverence. Jake discovered a deck of cards in the kitchen junk drawer and immediately began teaching Mia a simple game that coaxed the first smile. Marcus had seen from the 6-year-old. Danny, however, remained at his post by the window, and Marcus realized that this boy would need explicit permission to stop functioning as the family's protector before he could begin to act like a child again. "Danny," Marcus said, settling into a chair near the window, "I need to talk to you about something important." The 12-year-old's attention immediately focused on Marcus with the intensity of someone accustomed to receiving critical information. "You've been taking care of everyone for a long time," Marcus continued. "Watching for danger, making sure your siblings were safe, helping your mom with decisions that should have been made by adults. You've done an incredible job, but you're on my property now, and I need you to understand that keeping everyone safe is my responsibility." Danny's face showed conflict between relief and the reluctance to give up control that had kept his family alive during their escape. "I know it's hard to stop being the lookout," Marcus said gently, "but you're 12 years old and you deserve a chance to be a kid. Can you trust me to handle the protection duties for a while? What if he finds us?" Danny asked, voicing the fear that clearly haunted all of them. "Then I'll deal with him," Marcus replied with a conviction that surprised even him. "This is my land, Danny, and I don't let anyone hurt people under my protection." Something in Marcus's tone seemed to penetrate Danny's defenses, because for the first time since arriving at the farm, the boy's shoulders relaxed and his constant scanning of the horizon stopped. "Could I maybe help you with farm work instead?" Danny asked. "I'm good with animals, and I learn quickly." "I'd appreciate the help," Marcus said, recognizing the boy's need to contribute rather than simply receive charity. Farming is always easier with an extra pair of hands. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself marveling at how quickly his empty house had filled with life and purpose. Rebecca proved to be naturally helpful, taking over meal preparation and cleaning tasks with the efficiency of someone grateful to have useful work to do. The children explored their temporary home with increasing confidence, and even Mia began to venture away from the safety of Rebecca's immediate vicinity. But it was the conversation Marcus overheard between Emma and Jake that truly drove home the transformation taking place under his roof. "Do you think we can stay here?" Emma asked her brother as they played cards at the kitchen table. "I don't know," Jake replied with the pragmatism of an 8-year-old who had learned not to expect good things to last. "But it's nice while we're here. Mr. Marcus is kind and nobody's yelling or hitting anybody. I like how quiet it is," Emma said. "And how the house smells like food cooking instead of beer and cigarettes." The simple comparison between his peaceful farmhouse and the violence they had escaped made Marcus's chest tight with protective anger and determination. These children deserved safety, stability, and the chance to experience childhood without fear. Whatever it took to provide those things, Marcus was prepared to do. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when Dr. Walsh returned to check on Lucy's progress and assess the family's overall condition. Her professional evaluation was encouraging. Lucy's pneumonia was responding well to treatment. Rebecca's ribs were healing properly, and the children showed signs of beginning to recover from the acute stress that had dominated their lives. "They're resilient," Jennifer told Marcus privately while the family rested in the living room. "Children often bounce back from trauma faster than adults. especially when they feel genuinely safe. But Marcus, this can't be a temporary solution. These kids need stability, education, legal protection from their father, and long-term security. No, Marcus replied, though he was still working through the implications of what long-term care for 5 children would require. But for now, they need time to heal and figure out their options. Have you thought about what you're going to do if Ray Collins traces them here? Jennifer asked. Marcus had been thinking about little else, actually. The isolation that had made his farm perfect for hiding a family also made it vulnerable to someone determined to cause harm. But looking at Danny's relaxed shoulders and Lucy's healthy breathing, at the way Mia had finally let go of her stuffed rabbit long enough to help with dinner preparations, Marcus knew that protection was a risk worth taking. He won't take them, Marcus said simply. Whatever it costs, whatever it requires, he won't take them. As evening settled over the Thompson Farm, bringing with it the peaceful sounds of rural life and the comforting rhythms of a household settling down for the night, Marcus reflected on how completely his world had changed in just 48 hours. The quiet, orderly existence he had maintained since Sarah's death had been replaced by something chaotic, challenging, and infinitely more meaningful. For the first time in 3 years, his house felt like a home again, filled with the voices and energy that came from caring for people who needed him. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also exactly what Marcus hadn't known he'd been missing: the profound satisfaction that came from protecting the vulnerable and providing safety for those who had nowhere else to turn. 3 days into what Marcus had begun thinking of as his new life, the phone call came that would shatter the fragile peace they had built at the Thompson Farm. It was 2:17 in the afternoon on Friday, and Marcus was in the barn with Danny, teaching the boy how to properly check cattle for signs of illness or injury, when the shrill ring of his cell phone cut through the peaceful sounds of livestock and autumn wind. The caller ID showed a number Marcus didn't recognize. But something about the timing and the persistence of the ringing, whoever was calling let it ring far longer than most telemarketers would, made him answer, despite his usual policy of ignoring unknown numbers. "Thompson," he said, his voice carrying the neutral tone he used with strangers. "This Marcus Thompson who owns the farm on County Road 47? The voice on the other end was rough, aggressive, and carried the kind of barely controlled anger that made Marcus's protective instincts surge to immediate alert. "Who's asking?" Marcus replied, moving away from Danny while gesturing for the boy to continue with the cattle check. "Name's Ray Collins. I'm looking for my wife and kids. Got reason to believe they might have passed through your area recently. Woman named Rebecca, traveling with 5 kids, probably looking for somewhere to hide." The casual way Ray Collins spoke about his family, as if they were runaway livestock rather than human beings fleeing for their lives, made Marcus's jaw clench with suppressed fury, but his voice remained carefully neutral as he responded. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. This is pretty isolated country out here. Don't get many travelers, especially not folks with children." "That's funny," Ray Collins continued, and Marcus could hear the threat underlying his conversational tone. "Because I got information that they were spotted heading west on Highway 34, and your little farm sits right along that route. You sure you haven't seen anything?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken, recognizing that this wasn't a casual inquiry, but an interrogation from someone who had clearly done research on potential hiding places in the area. The fact that Ray Collins had identified him by name and address meant the man was conducting a systematic search rather than randomly calling rural properties. "Like I said, I haven't seen anyone," Marcus repeated firmly. "If someone was trespassing on my property, I'd know about it. Well, if you do happen to see my family, you'll want to call me right away." Ray Collins's voice grew harder, more explicitly threatening. "Rebecca's not well, you understand. She gets confused, makes up stories. Takes the kids places they shouldn't be. I'm worried about their safety, especially with winter coming on. The transparent lie painting Rebecca as mentally unstable while positioning himself as a concerned husband revealed the kind of manipulative tactics that Marcus suspected Ray Collins had been using to control his family for years. It also suggested that the man had experience dealing with authorities and knew how to present himself as the reasonable party in any dispute. I'll keep an eye out, Marcus said, though every instinct screamed at him to hang up and cut off contact with this dangerous man. You do that, Ray Collins replied. And Thompson? I really appreciate folks who mind their own business and don't get involved in family matters that don't concern them. Saves everyone a lot of unnecessary trouble. The call ended, leaving Marcus staring at his phone and feeling like he'd just been threatened by someone with both the intention and capability to follow through on violence. The casual reference to unnecessary trouble carried implications that made Marcus's blood run cold when he thought about Rebecca and the children sleeping safely in his house. Danny approached from the cattle pen, clearly having overheard enough of the conversation to understand its significance. The boy's face had gone pale, and his eyes held the kind of fear that Marcus had hoped was beginning to fade from his young features. Was that him? Danny asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Yes, Marcus replied, seeing no point in lying to someone who had clearly learned to read adult conversations for signs of danger. He's looking for you, but he doesn't know you're here yet, Danny said with the pragmatic realism of someone who had learned not to trust in temporary safety. But he'll keep looking. He always keeps looking until he finds what he wants. Marcus studied the boy's face, seeing exhaustion and resignation that no 12-year-old should have to carry. Danny, what aren't you telling me about your father? What am I dealing with here? Danny was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with whether to reveal information that might make Marcus reconsider his willingness to help them. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering potentially devastating news. He doesn't just hit people, Danny said quietly. He hurts them in ways that don't always show. And he has friends who help him when he needs to find people or make problems go away. Mom always said he knows too many secrets about too many people for anyone to cross him safely. The implications of this revelation settled over Marcus like a cold fog. He wasn't just dealing with a typical domestic abuser, but with someone who apparently had connections to corruption and violence that extended far beyond his own family. The phone call hadn't been just a fishing expedition. It had been a warning shot from someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and force. We need to get back to the house, Marcus said, his mind already working through security measures and contingency plans. And we need to have a family meeting. The walk back to the farmhouse felt different now, with Marcus finding himself scanning the horizon for vehicles that didn't belong and calculating how quickly someone could reach his property from the main road. The isolation that had made his farm perfect for hiding a family now felt like a vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with violent intentions. Rebecca was in the kitchen when they entered, helping Emma and Lucy prepare what had become their afternoon ritual of homemade cookies. The domestic scene flower dusting the counter, children's laughter echoing through the room. The warm smell of baking filling the air stood in stark contrast to the dark reality that Marcus and Danny carried with them from the barn. Rebecca. We need to talk, Marcus said, his serious tone immediately capturing her attention and causing her to stiffen with the reflexive alertness of someone always expecting bad news. What happened? She asked, her voice already tight with fear. Ray called me, Marcus said simply, watching as the color drained from Rebecca's face and her hand instinctively moved to her throat where fading finger marks still showed evidence of his last assault. He knows we're here. The question came out as barely a whisper, and Marcus could see Rebecca's fight or flight response activating as she began calculating escape routes and gathering her mental resources for another run. He suspects this area, but he doesn't know you're here specifically, Marcus clarified quickly. But Rebecca, we need to talk about what we're really dealing with. Danny mentioned that Ray has connections, people who help him when he needs to. Find someone or solve problems. Rebecca sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her face showing the defeat of someone who had hoped they were finally safe, but was being forced to confront the reality that safety might be impossible to achieve. He knows people, she confirmed quietly, glancing toward the children, who were pretending to focus on their baking while obviously straining to hear every word of the adult conversation. Police officers, judges, people in the county government. When I tried to get a restraining order 2 years ago, it got dismissed before I even had a hearing. The court clerk told me off the record that I should drop it and work things out at home. Marcus felt his anger building as Rebecca painted a picture of systematic corruption that protected abusers while leaving their victims without legal recourse. The carefully constructed world of rural law enforcement, where personal relationships often mattered more than legal procedures, had apparently been weaponized by Ray Collins to maintain control over his family. What about your parents? Other family members who might help? Marcus asked, though Rebecca's isolated situation suggested that those connections had likely been severed years ago. My parents died in a car accident when Danny was a baby, Rebecca said. Ray made sure I lost touch with most of my friends. Over the years, he said people were trying to interfere in our marriage, turn me against him. By the time I realized what was happening, I didn't have anyone left to call. The classic pattern of domestic abuse, isolation, control, the systematic destruction of support networks, had clearly been implemented with devastating effectiveness in Rebecca's case. Ray Collins had spent years ensuring that his wife would have nowhere to turn when his abuse escalated beyond what she could endure. What about Mia's situation? Marcus asked, remembering that one of the children wasn't biologically related to Rebecca. How did she end up with you? Her mother Sarah was my closest friend, maybe my only real friend, Rebecca explained. She lived next door to us in Hartwell. When she got sick with cancer last month, she made me promise to take care of Mia if anything happened to her. She said she didn't trust the state system to keep Mia safe, especially with Ray living so close. Marcus realized that Rebecca's decision to flee hadn't just been about protecting her own children, but about honoring a dying friend's request to care for an orphan child. The additional responsibility would have made escape exponentially more difficult, but Rebecca had chosen to honor her promise rather than abandon Mia to an uncertain fate. So legally, you don't have custody of Mia? Marcus asked, recognizing another layer of complication in an already complex situation. Not officially, Rebecca admitted. Sarah died before she could change her will or make legal arrangements. As far as the state knows, Mia should be in foster care. But Sarah begged me not to let that happen, said she'd heard stories about what happens to kids in the system. Marcus absorbed this information, understanding that their situation was even more precarious than he had initially realized. Not only were they hiding from a violent man with law enforcement connections, but they were also technically harboring a child who was supposed to be in state custody. Mr. Marcus? Lucy's small voice interrupted the adult conversation, and Marcus turned to see the 4-year-old approaching with the direct manner that children often used when addressing serious subjects. Are we going to have to run away again? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him that 5 innocent children were depending on adult decisions that would determine whether they spent their childhood in safety or in constant fear. Looking at Lucy's trusting face, at Emma's worried expression, at the way Jake had moved closer to Danny for comfort, Marcus felt his resolve crystallize into something approaching fierce determination. No, sweetheart, Marcus said, kneeling down to Lucy's eye level and speaking with the kind of conviction that children needed to hear when their world felt uncertain. You're not running anywhere. This is where you live now, and nobody's going To make you leave. But what if the bad man comes here? Lucy asked with the matter-of-fact tone that children used when discussing their worst fears. Marcus looked up at Rebecca, seeing both hope and terror in her expression as she waited to hear how he would answer her daughter's question. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical presence, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, Marcus felt energized by the clarity of purpose that came with protecting people who had no one else to turn to. If the bad man comes here, Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision, then he'll have to deal with me. And Lucy, I promise you that I'm a lot stronger and a lot meaner than any bad man who might try to hurt your family. The simple declaration seemed to satisfy Lucy's need for reassurance, but Marcus could see in Rebecca's face that she understood the full implications of what he had just promised. He wasn't just offering temporary shelter anymore. He was committing to stand between Ray Collins and the people under his protection, regardless of the personal cost. As the family finished preparing their afternoon snack and settled into the comfortable routines that had developed over their few days together, Marcus found himself thinking about practical preparations for what might be coming. The farm's isolation could work in their favor if properly utilized, but it would require planning, resources, and the kind of strategic thinking that his agricultural background hadn't prepared him for. But looking around his kitchen, seeing children who had learned to laugh again and a woman who was beginning to believe that safety might be possible, Marcus knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the determination of someone who had finally found his true purpose in life. Ray Collins might have connections and resources, but Marcus had something potentially more powerful, the absolute conviction that came from protecting innocent people who had nowhere else to turn. The weekend following Ray Collins' threatening phone call transformed the Thompson Farm from a peaceful refuge into something resembling a fortress under preparation for siege. Marcus had spent Friday night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and mentally cataloging every vulnerability his property presented to someone with violent intentions and local connections. By Saturday morning, he had developed a comprehensive security plan that would have impressed a military strategist. His first call was to Jake Morrison, his closest neighbor 5 miles to the east, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to take over his family's grain operation. Jake was one of the few people in the county who understood both rural security and modern tactical thinking, making him the perfect ally for what Marcus suspected was coming. "Jake, I need your advice on some security improvements," Marcus said, when his neighbor answered the phone. "Can you come over this morning and bring your expertise in?" Defensive preparations. There was a pause before Jake responded, his voice sharpening with the alertness that came from combat experience. "Marcus, are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you need backup... "Not trouble yet," Marcus replied carefully. "But I've got some people staying with me who need protection, and I want to be prepared for all possibilities." Jake Morrison arrived within an hour, driving his battered pickup truck and carrying a duffel bag that Marcus suspected contained more than just tools. Jake was a compact man in his early 30s, with the kind of controlled intensity that marked veterans who had seen serious action overseas. His pale blue eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the Thompson property with the trained gaze of someone evaluating tactical advantages and potential threats. "Tell me what we're dealing with," Jake said without preamble as they stood in Marcus's kitchen, coffee cups steaming between them. Marcus provided a carefully edited version of the situation: domestic violence, children in danger, a dangerous man with law enforcement connections who was actively searching for his escaped family. He didn't mention names or specific details, but Jake's military experience allowed him to read between the lines and understand the seriousness of the threat. "How much time do you think we have?" Jake asked, already shifting into operational planning mode. "Could be days, could be weeks," Marcus admitted. "But he's persistent and he's got resources." Eventually, he's going to narrow his search to this area. What followed was an intensive morning of property assessment and strategic planning. Jake walked the entire perimeter of the farm, identifying sight lines, potential approach routes, and defensive positions. He noted that the long gravel driveway provided early warning of approaching vehicles, while the barn and outbuildings could serve as fallback positions if the main house became compromised. Your biggest advantage is the isolation, Jake explained as they stood on the farmhouse porch, looking out over the expanse of prairie that surrounded them. Nobody can approach without being seen from at least a quarter-mile away. But that same isolation means you're on your own if trouble comes calling. What about alerting authorities? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. If this guy really has connections in local law enforcement, calling the sheriff could make things worse instead of better, Jake replied grimly. You might end up with deputies who are more interested in helping him than protecting his family. Jake's assessment confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the corruption that Ray Collins apparently enjoyed. In rural communities where everyone knew everyone else, personal loyalty often trumped legal obligations, creating situations where victims of domestic violence found themselves betrayed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. So what do you recommend? Marcus asked. Jake pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began sketching a rough diagram of the property. First, we set up an early warning system. Motion sensors along the main access routes, cameras if you can get them installed quickly. Second, we establish secure communication satellite phone in case cellular towers get compromised. Third, we create predetermined defensive positions and evacuation routes. This sounds like preparing for a military assault, Marcus said, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what Jake was proposing. Domestic abusers with resources and connections can be every bit as dangerous as enemy combatants, Jake replied seriously. Maybe more so, because they're fighting on familiar territory and they don't follow rules of engagement. While Jake continued his security assessment, Marcus returned to the house to find Rebecca helping the children with a project that had apparently been developing all morning. They were creating what Danny proudly described as an emergency kit, backpacks for each family member containing essential supplies, important documents, and comfort items that could be grabbed quickly if they needed to evacuate, we learned. To always be ready to run, Emma explained to Marcus as she carefully folded spare clothes into her small backpack. Mama taught us that sometimes safe places don't stay safe, so you have to be prepared to find a new one. The matter-of-fact way the children discussed emergency preparedness broke Marcus's heart while simultaneously reinforcing his determination to provide them with the kind of security that would make such preparations unnecessary. No child should have to live with the constant awareness that safety was temporary and survival depended on staying ready to flee. That's smart planning, Marcus said, though he made a mental note to discuss with Rebecca how to help the children feel more secure without abandoning reasonable precautions. But I want you to know that this is your home now, and we're going to do everything we can to keep it safe. Mia, who had been quietly organizing her few possessions, looked up at Marcus with the serious expression that had become her default since her mother's death. My mama used to say that home isn't a place. It's people who love you, she said in her soft voice. Do you love us, Mr. Marcus? The question hit Marcus with unexpected force, cutting straight to the emotional core of everything that had happened over the past week. These children had been thrust into his life by circumstance, but somewhere between Lucy's fever breaking and Danny's willingness to trust him with guard duty, they had become something more than refugees seeking shelter. Yes, sweetheart, Marcus said, kneeling down to Mia's eye level and speaking with the kind of conviction that children needed to hear. I love all of you very much. That's why we're going to make sure you're safe here. Mia nodded solemnly, as if his declaration had answered an important question that had been weighing on her young mind. She returned to packing her emergency kit, but Marcus noticed that her movements had lost some of their desperate efficiency and taken on the more relaxed pace of someone who believed in the possibility of long-term security. Jake Morrison returned to the house as lunch was being prepared, his tactical assessment complete and his recommendations ready for implementation. Over sandwiches and soup, he outlined a comprehensive security plan that balanced reasonable precautions with the realities of rural life. First priority is early warning, Jake explained, sketching on a napkin while the children listened with the intense attention of people who understood that their safety depended on adult planning. We set up motion detectors at 3 key points along your access road. Solar-powered, wireless transmission to receivers in the house. Gives you at least 5 minutes warning of approaching vehicles. What about during the day when we're working? Outside? Danny asked, clearly thinking like someone who had been responsible for family security for far too long. Good question, Jake replied, treating the 12-year-old's concern with the respect it deserved. We establish sight lines from work areas to the main approach routes, and we set up a communication system so anyone can alert everyone else immediately. The conversation continued through lunch and into the afternoon, with Jake providing detailed instructions on everything from secure communication protocols to defensive positioning. But it was his final recommendation that surprised Marcus the most. You need to document everything, Jake said seriously. Every threat, every phone call, every incident of stalking or harassment. Take photographs of injuries, save voicemails. Keep detailed records with dates and times. If this situation escalates to the point where law enforcement gets involved, you want to have evidence that can't be dismissed or ignored. What if the law enforcement personnel are compromised? Rebecca asked, voicing the fear that had been haunting her since her first failed attempt to get help through official channels. Then you go over their heads, Jake replied. State police, FBI, federal prosecutors who specialize in civil rights violations. Corruption works both ways. People who protect abusers also create liability for their departments and themselves. Sometimes the threat of federal investigation is enough to motivate local officials to do their jobs properly. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself impressed by both Jake's thoroughness and his sensitivity to the emotional needs of the children. Despite the serious nature of the security planning, Jake managed to frame the preparations as exciting adventures, rather than terrifying necessities. He taught Danny and Emma how to use two-way radios, showed Jake and Mia how to identify safe hiding spots around the property, and explained emergency procedures in terms that made the children feel empowered rather than frightened. The most important thing to remember, Jake told the assembled family as his visit concluded, is that preparation isn't about expecting the worst to happen. It's about being ready so you can stay calm and make good decisions if anything unusual occurs. After Jake left, promising to return the next day with security equipment and additional tactical advice, Marcus found himself alone with Rebecca for the first time since Ray's threatening phone call. The children were occupied with their new emergency preparedness projects, giving the adults an opportunity for the kind of serious conversation that had been impossible with young ears listening. Marcus, I need you to understand what you're risking by helping us, Rebecca said, her voice heavy with the weight of someone who had learned to calculate the cost of every decision. Ray doesn't just threaten people, he follows through. And he's patient enough to wait for the right opportunity to make his point. What do you mean? Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would be more disturbing than he was prepared to hear. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with whether to share information that might make Marcus reconsider his commitment to protecting them. Finally, she spoke with the careful precision of someone describing traumatic events. 3 years ago, a neighbor named Tom Bradley tried to intervene when he saw Ray hitting me in our backyard, she said quietly. Tom was a good man, a veteran who thought he could handle himself in a confrontation. 2 weeks later, his barn burned down with his prize horses inside. A month after that, his insurance claim was denied for suspicious circumstances, and he lost his farm. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The systematic destruction of someone who had tried to help painted a picture of an adversary who was both patient and vindictive, someone who understood how to use economic pressure and social connections to punish perceived enemies. The fire department ruled it accidental, Rebecca continued. Said it was probably faulty wiring, even though Tom had just had the electrical system inspected. But everyone in town understood the real message. Helping Rebecca Collins wasn't worth losing everything you'd worked to build. That's when you knew you couldn't get help locally, Marcus said, understanding how completely isolated Rebecca had become. That's when I knew that Ray's reach extended further than I'd ever imagined, Rebecca corrected. And Marcus, if he's willing to destroy a man's livelihood for trying to help me, what do you think he'll do to someone who's actually hiding his family from him? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that made Marcus's protective anger burn even hotter. Ray Collins wasn't just a typical domestic abuser. He was someone who had weaponized local corruption and personal connections to create a web of control that extended far beyond his own household. Rebecca, Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet conviction that had been building since he first found them in his barn. Some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Those children deserve to grow up without fear, and you deserve to live without looking over your shoulder every day. If that puts me in Ray's crosshairs, so be it. But what if he comes with help? What if he brings people who are willing to do whatever it takes to get us back? Rebecca's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been running from an enemy. She couldn't outfight or outlast. Marcus looked out the window toward the barn where this had all started, thinking about the peaceful life he had built since Sarah's death and the way it had been transformed by 5 children and their desperate mother. The quiet routine of farming, the predictable rhythm of seasons and livestock, the careful solitude he had maintained, all of it felt like a previous life now, replaced by something far more complicated and infinitely more meaningful. Then we'll be ready for them, Marcus said simply. Jake knows what he's doing, and this property has advantages that most people don't appreciate. But more importantly, Rebecca, they're not just fighting me anymore. They're fighting a man who's finally found something worth protecting. As evening settled over the Thompson Farm, bringing with it the peaceful sounds of children playing and dinner preparations, Marcus reflected on how completely his priorities had shifted in the space of a week. The isolated farmer who had answered his phone that Friday afternoon was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true security came not from avoiding conflict, but from being willing to stand between danger and the people who depended on him for protection. 2 weeks after Jake Morrison's security preparations were completed, the motion sensors triggered at 3:47 a.m. on a moonless Tuesday night. Marcus woke instantly to the soft chime that indicated movement along the main access road, his farmer's instincts and military-style training combining to bring him to full alertness within seconds. The digital display beside his bed showed 2 vehicles approaching slowly, their headlights extinguished as they navigated the gravel driveway by ambient starlight alone. Marcus activated the emergency protocol that Jake had drilled into all of them. Silent alarm signals went to every bedroom, waking Rebecca and the children with gentle vibrations rather than sounds that might carry to unwanted ears. Within 90 seconds, the entire family had moved to the designated safe room, a reinforced basement storage area that Jake had helped Marcus prepare with emergency supplies, communication equipment, and multiple exit routes. "Stay calm and stay quiet," Marcus whispered to the children as they huddled together in the basement. "Remember what we practiced. This is probably nothing, but we're going to follow our plan just to be safe." But even as he spoke reassuring words, Marcus felt his pulse quicken with the certainty that their period of peaceful sanctuary was ending. Ray Collins had finally tracked them down. And he hadn't come alone. Through the basement window, Marcus could see two dark SUVs pulling up near the farmhouse, their occupants moving with the coordinated precision of people who had planned this operation carefully. 4 men emerged from the vehicles, and even in the dim light, Marcus could see that they carried themselves like law enforcement officers, or people who wanted to be mistaken for law enforcement officers. Marcus activated the satellite phone that Jake had insisted on installing, speed dialing his neighbor's number while keeping his voice low enough not to carry beyond the basement walls. "Jake, they're here," Marcus said when his neighbor answered on the first ring. 4 men, 2 vehicles, moving like professionals. "I'm already in position," Jake replied, his voice carrying the calm focus of someone who had been expecting this moment. "State police are en route, but they're 40 minutes out. Can you hold that long?" "We'll find out," Marcus said, checking the shotgun he had hoped never to use while watching Rebecca comfort 5 terrified children who were reliving their worst nightmares. The knock on the front door came 5 minutes later, authoritative, demanding, designed to intimidate rather than request entry. Through the basement's audio monitoring system, Marcus could hear Ray Collins's voice clearly for the first time, and the tone confirmed everything Rebecca had told him about this man's capacity for violence. "Marcus Thompson," Ray called out, his voice carrying across the prairie silence. "I know you're in there, and I know you're harboring my family. This doesn't have to get complicated if you just send them out now." Marcus remained silent, following Jake's advice about not engaging in conversations that could escalate the situation. But Ray Collins wasn't finished with his psychological warfare. "Thompson, I've got friends here who are real interested in your property taxes and building permits. Seems like there might be some irregularities that could cause you serious problems with county officials. But we can work all that out if you just cooperate with a man trying to reunite with his worried family." The threat was clear: comply or face the same kind of systematic harassment that had destroyed Tom Bradley. But Marcus had spent 2 weeks preparing for this moment, and his resolve had only strengthened as he watched 5 children learn to trust again and their mother begin to believe in the possibility of safety. "Rebecca," Ray's voice continued, carrying the manipulative tone that abusers used when public audiences might be listening. "Honey, I know you're scared and confused, but the kids need their father. Come on out and let's talk about this like the family we are." In the basement, Rebecca pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a sob of terror, while Danny moved protectively in front of his younger siblings. The boy's face showed the kind of determined fury that came from someone who had endured too much and was prepared to fight rather than surrender. That's when everything changed. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. They're not the local sheriff's department that Ray Collins might have been able to influence, but the distinctive wail of state police vehicles responding to Jake Morrison's emergency call. Through the monitoring system, Marcus could hear confusion and anger in the voices outside as Ray's carefully planned operation began to unravel. "What the hell?" one of Ray's companions said. "You said this would be a simple pickup." "It should have been," Ray replied, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "Thompson must have called someone." Jake Morrison's voice suddenly boomed across the property through a megaphone that he had positioned strategically during his security preparations. "This is Jake Morrison, U.S. Army veteran and witness to attempted home invasion. I have video evidence of armed trespassers threatening a family with children. State police are 90 seconds out." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating to Ray's operation. Whatever story he had planned to tell about retrieving his confused wife and children became impossible to maintain in the face of witness testimony and recorded evidence of criminal behavior. But Ray Collins hadn't spent years terrorizing his family only to be deterred by the arrival of authorities. His voice, when it came through the monitoring system again, carried the kind of desperate violence that made Marcus check his weapon and prepare for the worst-case scenario. "Rebecca, Ray screamed, abandoning all pretense of being a concerned husband. You think you can hide from me forever? You think some farmer and his army buddy can protect you? I'll burn this place down with all of you inside before I let you keep my kids from me. The threat galvanized Marcus into action. This was no longer about hiding and waiting for help. This was about protecting 5 children from a man who had just announced his willingness to commit murder rather than lose control over his victims. Marcus emerged from the basement to the exit that led to the barn, circling behind Ray's position while Jake maintained overwatch from his concealed location. The state police sirens were getting closer, but Ray Collins was beyond rational calculation now, driven by the rage of a predator whose prey had finally escaped his control. "Marcus Thompson," Ray called out one final time. "You have 10 seconds to send my family out, or I start shooting through windows." That's when Marcus stepped out of the shadows 20 feet behind Ray Collins, his shotgun trained on the man who had terrorized Rebecca and 5 innocent children for years. "Ray Collins," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had found his line in the sand and was prepared to defend it. "You're trespassing on my property, threatening children, and making terrorist threats against innocent people. Drop your weapon and surrender to the authorities who are about to arrive." Ray spun around, his pistol coming up in a movement that spoke of dangerous familiarity with violence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 men faced each other across 20 feet of Nebraska prairie, the abuser who had ruled through fear and intimidation, and the farmer who had discovered that some things were worth fighting for regardless of personal cost. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Ray said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose world was collapsing around him. "I own half the law enforcement in this county. I've got judges who owe me favors and politicians who need my support. You can't protect them from me." "Maybe not from all of you," Marcus replied steadily, "but I can protect them from you, right here, right now." The standoff ended when state police vehicles surrounded the property, their spotlights illuminating the scene and their loudspeakers demanding that all armed individuals lay down their weapons. Ray Collins, faced with the choice between surrender and a gunfight he couldn't win, finally lowered his pistol with the bitter defeat of someone whose reign of terror had finally reached its end. The arrest that followed was swift and thorough. Ray Collins and his 3 companions, who turned out to include 2 off-duty sheriff's deputies from his home county, were taken into custody on charges ranging from trespassing and terroristic threats to conspiracy and abuse of authority. Jake Morrison's recorded evidence and witness testimony provided the foundation for federal civil rights charges that would ultimately expose the corruption network Ray had used to maintain control over his victims. But for Marcus, the most important moment came when he returned to the basement to find 5 children and their mother waiting with the kind of hope he hadn't seen in their eyes since that first morning in his barn. "Is it over?" Lucy asked in her small voice, looking up at Marcus with complete trust that he would tell her the truth. "It's over, sweetheart," Marcus said, kneeling down to gather all 5 children into the kind of group hug that had become his favorite part of every day. "The bad man can't hurt anyone anymore." The legal proceedings that followed were complex but ultimately decisive. Ray Collins's network of corruption unraveled under federal investigation, leading to multiple convictions and a complete restructuring of law enforcement in 3 counties. Rebecca was granted full custody of her children and legal guardianship of Mia, whose late mother's wishes were finally recognized by family court. More importantly for the Thompson Farm family, the threat that had hung over them for so long was permanently removed. Ray Collins received a 20-year federal sentence for civil rights violations, domestic terrorism, and conspiracy charges. His law enforcement allies faced their own prosecutions, and the corruption that had protected him was dismantled by authorities who took seriously their obligation to protect rather than persecute domestic violence victims. But the real transformation had already taken place in the hearts and lives of 6 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances. Marcus adopted all 5 children legally, while Rebecca became his wife in a simple ceremony held in the same barn where they had first met. The farmhouse that had echoed with loneliness for 3 years was filled with the laughter, arguments, homework struggles, and bedtime stories that marked the daily rhythm of a large and loving family. Danny grew into the kind of responsible young man that his early trials had prepared him to become. But now his protective instincts were channeled toward helping other children rather than serving as the sole defender of his family. Emma discovered a love of literature that would eventually lead her to become a teacher like Marcus's late wife Sarah. Jake developed into a skilled mechanic who used his talents to help neighbors rather than fear authority figures. Lucy grew up with no memory of fear, her childhood filled with the security that every child deserved. And Mia, the orphaned neighbor child who had carried the weight of loss at such a young age, blossomed into a young woman who understood that families could be created through love and choice rather than just biology. Her stuffed rabbit, once clutched desperately as her only source of comfort, eventually found its place of honor on the bookshelf in her room, a reminder of survival rather than a necessity for security. On quiet evenings, when the farm work was done and the children were settled into their homework or their games, Marcus would sometimes find himself standing in the doorway of his kitchen, watching Rebecca prepare dinner while 5 children who had once hidden in his barn now filled his house with the sound of home. The isolation that had once felt like protection now felt like abundance, not empty space, but room for love to grow. The Thompson Farm had become exactly what Sarah had always envisioned it could be, a place where people could build something beautiful together, where children could grow up surrounded by the kind of security that came from being unconditionally loved, and where the daily work of caring for living things extended far beyond livestock to encompass the most important responsibility of all: protecting and nurturing the innocent. Marcus had discovered that the most meaningful battles weren't fought for abstract principles or distant causes, but for the people who depended on you to stand between them and the darkness that threatened to destroy their hope. In finding 5 children and their mother hiding in his barn, he had found his true calling as a protector, a father, and a man whose life finally had the kind of purpose that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The bruised woman and 5 orphans who had sought shelter in his barn had given him something far more valuable than he had given them. They had shown him that love was always worth fighting for, and that families were built not just through birth, but through the conscious choice to protect and cherish those who needed a safe place to call home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.